Okay, you ready to go? Okay. So Joe, thanks very much for doing the interview. And first of all, what we're saying to you, what we normally do is just, at the start is just ask you to tell us a little bit about your family, where they came from, were they from Waterford, or where they...
Do I have to say anything about my name or who I am?
Oh yeah, do so.
Okay, Joe Kelly, current Metropolitan Mayor of Waterford City, or the Waterford Metropolitan area. I'm originally born and bred in Hennessy's Road, 128 Hennessy's Road. I was actually born in the upstairs room in the house, so I didn't even get to a hospital. My father and mother were John Kelly and Jane Kelly. My father came from Robinson's Lane, an old lane still in existence here in Waterford, just beside Ballybricken Church. And my mother, known as Jane Sheen, or Janie Sheen, even in our married days, people still just call her Janie Sheen. That seems to be the way. She came from a place called Grace's Lane, and I think that lane is now not there anymore. But so very, traditional, long-established families in Waterford.
And what kind of, we say, what did your dad work at, or your mother's father work at, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Well, my father, he worked in his latter years in CIE as a goodsman over in the railways, and he'd work in the yard, and there would have been cattle being shipped at the time. There were cattle loaded onto carriages and unloaded off of carriages. And then in the goods yard, as his health deteriorated, he was put inside one of essentially a porta cabin, and he would check the dockets of goods coming in and goods going out, that type of stuff. Prior to that, he had emigrated back in those days, as an awful lot of Irish did, and he went to work in the Ford plant in Dagenham, just outside of London, or a suburb of London. And he told me many a time that's where he thinks his health deteriorated, because he worked in the furnaces areas, pouring hot metal. There was no health and safety much back then, he told me. And they breathing in an awful lot of hot air and dust and so on. And so his lungs were shot to bits, really. So he came back out of there with severe lung damage, and he ended up with bronchitis and asthma pretty much for the rest of his life. And he died a young man at only 62 years of age. From my mother's side, her father, I don't know what he did, but he operated a lot with greyhounds. He loved the hounds, like lots of men even today. And I don't know whether he made a living out of greyhounding, but that's what he was at. What he actually worked at, I don't know. And on my father's side, Billy Kelly would have been my father's father. He was what they called a Jarvey man at the time. So basically he was like one of the first taxi men in Waterford, but he went around with a horse and cart, like a pony and trap for all the world. And people would hire him then that he would come along and pick him up and maybe bring him up to the hospital, maybe, or bring him to a funeral and things like that. So that was the kind of work that they were involved in.
And where did you go to primary school?
I went to primary school in Mount Sion, up in Barrack Street, not far from your own house. So yeah, I started there when I was, in babies, first babies we used to call it in those days. I then went all the way through to finish my primary school in Mount Sion.
And did you go to secondary?
No, I didn't, not in Mount Sion. When I finished in primary, I left then and went to the Tech, to what the current Waterford College of Further Education, back then commonly known and loved as known as the Tech. So I went there. So I didn't even finish, I didn't do a junior cert or anything in Mount Sion. I went straight to the Tech, where we studied for the group cert, and it was more into the trades in those days. People were hoping to become apprentice plumbers or electricians or wherever it was. It was often seen in those days as maybe a school for those who weren't academically gifted, if I can put it that way. But I found it exactly the opposite of that when I went down there. I found that the students that I was with were very, very, very smart people, very clever. They mightn't be studying Shakespeare, but they were gifted at drawing, at metalwork, crafts, woodwork, design, art, all of those kind of things. They were gifted at that kind of thing. And that was really interesting.
Did you ever draw for anything like that?
I was very good at art. I was always able to draw, both technical drawing, which would be very technical, but the actual freehand, the actual art of drawing animals, drawing tables, whatever, I can sketch, still can. And so I always had a love of that kind of thing. And even to this day, I have a huge love of art. I love art exhibitions, and particularly the local art that are own. And we have huge range of artists here in Waterford. And I love seeing their work and buying whatever pieces I can at different times. And I have more pieces now that I can hang in my house, actually. I don't have enough space. But I love it. And I think supporting local art and giving people a chance to show what they can do is really important. And an awful lot of that was brought out in people down into tech. I found that the teachers there had a different focus than, let's say, Mount Sion or perhaps other schools. They kind of looked at the person more to see where your talents were, not just can you read and write and can you do maths, even though you had to do all of that as well. But they looked, I suppose, at the person in the round, and that they looked at what other talents have you, what could you do. And at the time as well, companies would come to the tech when they'd be hiring. So they'd come and approach the teachers or the headmaster and say, well, we're hiring woodworkers, or we need 3 electricians, or whatever it might be. And the word then would go around the classes, such a company are interested in electricians or fitters or whatever it might be. Do you want to put your name forward for interview? And that was how it started for so many people. And people then went from the tech then into many, many of the companies that are around the city now. And that's really how it worked. But it was a really happy place. My memories of it is very fond. It was a joyful place. That's how I'd put it. It was a joyful place to go. I didn't like attending school in Mount Sion. It was a hard slog. It was the days of corporal punishment. Lots of us, including me, were badly beaten up by school teachers up there. There's no question about that. At the lower end of the scale, for instance, we used to have, this is just one example, and I think it's important to record it, that you'd get homework, and it was usually 4 maths problems, or sums, as we used to call them in those days. And for each one that you came in with the wrong answer, you got 4 slaps on your hand. So if you had 4 sums, and quite a lot of the lads weren't great at maths, we'd get the 4 of them wrong, you'd start maybe class in the morning with 16 slaps, 4 on each hand, switch over, and switch over, either with a stick or with a cane. And the one that would hurt the least, I suppose, was a thing called a leather. And that was a kind of a leather strap for all the world. I don't know if they're even used these days anymore, probably not. But at least it was a strap like a belt, but you got hit with the flat side of it. And so the flat side of it, although it made a big loud bang and would still hurt you, it wouldn't hurt you as much as a stick or a cane. The cane was terrible because it was quite narrow, so to be very, very defined in how the part of your hand that it impacted. And some of the teachers, for some strange reason, rather than hitting you on the fleshy part of your hand, they go to the joints of your fingers, because there's bone right there to inflict, the most severe pain. I could never figure out why they ever did that and why it was necessary to do it. Matter of fact, it was never necessary to do it. So I encountered a lot of that, and so did a lot of other friends of mine, and it was horrible.
This was children, right?
Children, oh yeah, children. From maybe second class, like when the real baby, the little ones, you wouldn't really get it. But when we got into anything like maybe what we used to call second class, third class, fourth class, fifth class. Yeah, and it depended on the teacher you had, of course. It was mostly the brothers, the Christian brothers. There were some at that stage, the civilian type teachers were starting to come into it. Like Mr. O'Brien, for instance. Fintan O'Brien, I think he was from the Cork Road, a beautiful man. Again, great care for the students, for the children. And you'd never see him, hardly raise his voice, never mind raise a hand against a child. So and there was a couple, I think there was a Mrs. O'Neill, if I recall, and they were, again, what I would call decent and normal people. The canes and the sticks was generally used by the brothers, but it was a horrendous time, and I was glad to leave there. Although I look back at it now, it was the place I went to school, is where I got the basics of my education. And they were good times. We did have Phelan and Scullin. I learned to play the tin whistle badly. but at least I learned it. We took part in choirs, and there was, there were the usual Christmas services and things, and there was the mass, and there was things like that. There was enjoyable stuff as well now, but that aspect of it is a bit that's seared into my memory. It's something I'll never forget, and I know that there's loads of my classmates are exactly the same, because occasionally we'd meet, around the town, and we sometimes recall or reflect back on Mount Sion, and they'd all talk about the hammerings they got in the school. It seemed to be the way it was, that was those times, and I think they're times that are well gone.
Absolutely. And then to go back to the tech, how did you hear about work coming up in the glass factory? How did that work?
It actually didn't come up about the glass at all from the tech. What happened was that, very similar to what I just said though, but it came in, it was a company out in the industrial estate at the time called Arco Kitchens. And the word came in that Arco Kitchens had jobs out there as apprentices. And that was in the woodworking game. And I was also very interested in woodworking. I'm still quite good at woodwork. And so people were asked, do you want to put your name forward to try and work, say, in Arco Kitchens and whatever? So I did. And we went out then for, a basic enough, I suppose, interview at the time. But myself and one or two other lads, we got taken on. So I started out there actually as an apprentice wood machinist. And that's where my work started. So just before I would have done what was the intermediate cert exam back in those days, I think it's called the junior certificate nowadays, I'd finished my group cert, so I was all right on the apprenticeship side of it. That was the general qualification for apprenticeships at the time, the group cert. I had that. And just before, a few months before the intercert, that position came up. So I went home and I said to my father and mother that, look, I have a chance of going in here to work, or I can stay in school and carry on with the studies. And between the three of us, I suppose, we decided that we'd go for the job, because money was still very short at the time. And they said, look, you'd be contributing to the house. And this was when I was like approaching sort of 16 kind of mark. And so I said, right, then I was always interested in study. And, in latter years, I went back to adult education and, qualified in lots of different things. But I always had that love of education. Despite what happened in Mount Sion, I always felt that education was something I was interested in. But anyway, I cut my education short and went out to Arco, and I got the job. So I started working out there as a wood machinist, an apprentice wood machinist, learning how to, cut the various pieces. Very dangerous machines, I have to say, like, circular saws, high-powered machines. But I enjoyed the work out there, and there were lots of people out there that I remember well, working with Joe Barnes and his brother John, known as Bouncer Barnes. We had Jackie Fletcher, we had Frankie Swift, Christy Carroll was the manager at the time. Shawnee Welch, who's still around up in St. Paul's Parish. Shawnee was the manager on the floor, the supervisor, a lovely man. He's where he got all of us new workers to start saving, actually, his gas. He was involved with the credit union movement right back in the early days. And though we were only apprentices, earning very small money, I can't remember in the days, it was back in the days of shillings anyway. He was saying, now lads, we have to open a credit union account for you now, up in St. Paul's. Saving is the key to getting on in future life. And I remember we used to put £1 a week, I think it was, into the credit union. Shawnee would take it out of our wage packet, or we'd give it to him. Back in those days, you got a wage packet with real money. It wasn't checks, or it wasn't any EFTs or any of that. And up he'd go and he'd lodge the money into your account. And so I'm still a member of that credit union, by the way. But that's how that started. So that was another interesting little story. But it was a great bunch of lads. We had great time in the factory. It was good fun. We had to be careful, of course, with the dangerous machines and so on. There was elements of factory leagues at the time. That was in its heyday. We always had a reasonable enough team. So the fun and the crack was just brilliant. And I stayed there, I think it was just shy of 2 years. And what happened was this, the glass factory story comes in then. Some of the lads in the class, as you suggested, they went to the glass factory and were apprentices in the glass factory. But their pay was substantially more than mine out in Arco. And I used to meet them around, and I can't remember the exact figures, But I think my pay at the time was, I think it was something like £3.50. It was a real apprentice starting rate, you know. But the starting rate the lads had was £6.50 in the glass, which was huge money. And I was saying, God, I said, that's some difference. You know, the lads were saying, Joe, you're stupid, I haven't gone into that place. You should have come in with us and all the rest of it. So I started thinking about it. And there was another interesting thing in the glass. When you got over your initial 6 months, the 650 went to about 950. You got a huge jump when you were kind of in the training school for the 6 months, and you went around on the benches and things like that. But after 6 months, you were sort of nearly permanently placed on someone's bench. And that's when you got this extra big kind of a chunk. So you went up to about £9 or £9.50, which was miles away from where I was. So when the next tranche of glass factory positions were coming up, and they were being recruited fairly regularly at that time because the factory was expanding at a huge rate, I put my name in, I got a form, sent it into the glass, and I was duly called in for an interview. And I think I was interviewed by Sean Dunphy initially. God be merciful to Sean. And I passed whatever, I would say, fairly basic interview was involved. And I was called in then for testing. And so I was actually tested in 2 places. I was tested in the blowing room, where we went up and did a basic day or so of blowing, practicing. And then we basically blew a ball at the end of the iron. And I was also then given a chance in the cutting shops. So we went down into the cutting shops, and again did about, I think it was a day, maybe 2, but certainly 1 day anyway, of cutting. You were taught from the very basics by, there were 2 people in the cutting shops training school at the time, Frank Welsh from Romore Park area, and Leslie Holness, who was also sort of the manager of the training school. So Frank guided me in cutting from the very basic stars, as we call them, on the end of waste, or, you know, glass that weren't, you know, of any value. They would have been scrap and so on. And you get to train throughout the whole sort of day, and for the last half hour or so, then you were given 3 tumblers, 3 whiskey tumblers to test on. So you had to cut this star on the end of the tumbler, and it had to be, you can see it's the same star that's now on tumblers even this day. It was a 16, what we call a 16-point star. So you cut this, and it had to come into a very precise centre point. All the cuts had to cross at exactly the same point in the centre. And you had to be not perfect, but close enough to it to pass. They were then examined by Frank and by, say, Leslie Holness, and they decided then that they were good enough or not. And it turns out mine were. And about a week or 2 after that, then I was called in to actually officially start in the company. So I told Arco then that I was leaving, and they were all disappointed, not because I was a brilliant apprentice, but, you know what I mean, they had put some time into me. But I said, look, I'm going. Excuse me, we had, have a better job. And in fairness, the lads that were with me were saying, you're dead right. You know, they were fully qualified cabinet makers or fully qualified wood machinists, but they were saying the prospects of really good pay in the glass were far better than in the woodwork business. And so it turned out we did end up with a very good job and very well paid job. So I started my 5 years of apprenticeships then.
And would there be resentment from other factories in town because of that, because of the wages, in the sense that they couldn't pay as much to young lads like you and not?
I think there was, maybe not by everybody, but some people saw it as perhaps, I don't know if it's quite resentment, but I've heard things said back to me since that, you know, the glass lads were very cocky. They were always going around with the newest cars, and they always had 1 or 2 holidays a year, where some people didn't have any holidays a year. And you could nearly expand it out that, you know, we're nearly lauding it over people. Now, I was never really, I wouldn't consider myself to be in that category. Indeed, lots of people I know, I don't really know anybody that was in, but seeing it from the outside, people have a different view. And I've heard that said back to me a few times, that's how people felt. And even I saw it when the factory finally went, a disaster for this city, which we still haven't recovered from. There were social media talk and various comments, deserved them, it's what they deserved, sure they had it good enough long enough, and so on. But what people seem to miss out on or forget was that the glass factory kept this city going for years. The amount of money came out of that factory and spent in the local economy kept other jobs going, shops, car sales, everything else that you can, mechanics, electricians, small builders with extensions and so on. It had huge impact on the financial economy in the city and the social aspect of the city too, because every single charity that was ever needed money, the glass factory were generally the first up to support them. We used to have, when we were looking for cancer services in Waterford, and at the time people forget that we didn't have them, just like the 24/7 now we don't have it. That's the latest campaign. The Waterford Crystal workers were putting 50 cent a week out of everybody's wage packet on a voluntary basis to start funding towards 24/7 and keeping a campaign going. It's the same with Dr. Condon and the eye unit. He's now one of the world's leading eye specialists. It was the glass factory that supported all of that initial work. And you know, the Little Sisters of the Poor, they're now over in Ferrybank. But when they were in Convent Hill there, up on Bunkers Hill, I should say, every Friday they were a constant outside the gates of the factory with their little boxes. And people always put money in. And I was talking to the nuns only recently in Ferrybank when I visited there for a mass for the residents and for the volunteers. And the Mother Superior there was only saying to me, she remembers the support from the glass and those weekly collections outside the gate and how generous people were. So the money was spread around. It was never kept. It was always spent in the city, the local pubs, the hotels, and so there was huge benefit for the city, and subsequently a huge collapse around the city when the factory finally went.
To go back to when you were a young lad and you were going in at 18, what's your early memories of the glass factory? You know, when you were in the door, what was your first impression? Especially, you know, that first day when you went into the blowing section of the glass factory.
The first impression I had was the size of the place. I couldn't believe how big it was, and I got lost. I had to ask directions how to get the cutting shop training school was in what we called K4. They're all levelled now, but it was the closest block to what people might remember as the office block or the gallery, showrooms. It's closest to that. And you had to come in the K1 gate from Ash Road and make your way through all the other Ks in a kind of a zigzaggy enough route until you got there. And I got there eventually, and I was thinking, there were hundreds of benches lined up, 6 on a bench after bench after bench, cutters. And up at the far end was blowers. But just getting into the cutting shops, I finally made my way across, and that's what struck me, the enormity, the size of the place. And the tea break came at around 10, half 10 or so. And I remember, again, being wet under the ears, you didn't know anybody. So I wandered over to this canteen, didn't know how to buy any food or anything, because you weren't in the know. So it was one of the other lads that was in the training school training. He said, "You go up there, Joe, and you buy your blah." That's what we had then, blahs, and that was the main thing in Waterford Crystal. Was always the buttered blah, or the blah and the red lead, as we called it, the luncheon, right? Or we also had cheese blahs. They were the thing. And the real adventurous people had cheese blahs with crisps on them. This was a real treat altogether. This was great stuff. But anyway, I was only getting the basics, so I did. And we sat down and had it. But again, I found on the way back to the training school, again, I couldn't find my way back. I had to ask one of the cutters on a bench, actually. I said, "Look, I have to get back to the training school. I'm in doing a test." And he said, it's down there a bit and kind of turn the corner kind of stuff. And I found it. But that was the initial, the amount of workers and the amount of benches was the thing that struck me first. The thing was enormous. And when you think that in the height of the factory, there was about 3,200 people employed there. Like, there's nothing even to that scale, anything like it even today in Waterford City or County. And the factory not only had Kilbarry at the time, it had a Butlerstown factory, or at least it opened a Butlerstown factory, and in due course opened a Dungarvan factory, called, I think, the locals in Dungarvan used to call it Dungarvan Crystal. Now, there was never actually Dungarvan Crystal, it was always Waterford Crystal, but I suppose locals will always use their own name, but we had the Dungarvan Crystal, or Waterford Crystal Dungarvan, we had the Butlerstown factory, and we had Kilbarry, so it was a huge employer. And it was a wonderful place to work, I have to say. I'd never say a bad word about the glass factory. I'm delighted I went in there. The experience we had in there of work and the experience of people. It was a factory of characters, is how I describe it. The likes of Shammy Power. Now, Shammy since died a young man, but Christmas time he'd go around, get pushed around in one of what we call the trolleys, a cage, and a trolley with a cage on. And Shammy used to dress up as Santa Claus and have all these, either make some small real presents and a lot of mock ones wrapped up, and he'd go around dressed up. He had a beard himself anyway. And he'd be pushed around by the lads, or the general workers that dragged him around in a trolley, and he'd be shouting ho, ho, and happy Christmas to people around the place. It was also a great factory for music, and the American visitors and visitors from all over the world used to come in, were amazed at this, particularly coming up to Christmas time. Community singing went on in the cutting shops. It was unbelievable. There were people like Jimmy Flynn, still a great singer. Ben Delaney, a well-known local musician, used to join in. And all the rest of us would join in, and we'd start singing Christmas songs and hymns and carols. And when you had 50, 60, 80, 100 people all singing together in unison on these Christmas carols and Silent Night and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, or whatever it might be. And we had these American tours coming in, and they were astounded. Like, they had never seen anything like it. Who ever heard of a hard-working factory, people working on piece rate, but singing Christmas songs, and often a lot of the popular pop songs at the time. I mean, the memories are just fantastic. And the camaraderie among the people I found in the factory to be amazing. If anyone was sick or ill, or there was a death in the family, or there was anything like that, there was never any shortness of help or people to support or whatever. Sport was huge. And because the factory was so big, I mentioned the factory league earlier on. We'd often enter 12, maybe 14 teams from the glass factory into the factory league, and nearly every section had a number of teams. So you had K1 blowing with one or two teams, K2, K3, K4. Then you had the cutting shops of K1, K2, K3, K4, often 2 or 3 teams. Then you had the general sections. You'd have the semi-skilled with another team. And we used to have hurling. So Waterford Crystal had a huge amount of hurlers, because loads of people from Kilkenny worked in Waterford, and a lot of them were very good hurlers, just like the Waterford people. But they would have combined teams of hurling, and we'd had very, very strong inter-county teams or inter-factory teams of hurling, and Waterford Crystal again would be at the top of that because of our mix of Waterford and Kilkenny hurlers. It was just fantastic. It was just a fantastic place to work.
And when you started off first they put you into the cutting section.
Yeah.
That was based on your tests that you did. And then you started off into your apprenticeship. How did that work?
Well, there's a 5-year apprenticeship. And as I said, you start your first 6 months is basically you're attached to the training school. So you're down there certainly for the first month or so, just getting the basics of learning how to cut, maybe even the first 2 months. And some advanced a little bit quicker than others, but when you got to a basic level of skill that you could say cut stars pretty quickly and accurately enough, they then kind of put you out on the bench. If someone was out sick on a bench, they might put you up there for a day or two while the person is out, or a week, and you'd cut a lot of the stars on that bench. And it was getting you into the kind of the work routine of a bench. Then you'd go back to the training school and you'd learn a little bit more. The key cuts in Waterford Crystal, or in any kind of factory to do with glass, is the stars, which I mentioned, caro, which is a kind of a crossed pattern, is all I can describe it as, but you can see it on all of the pieces nearly. It's called caro, K-A-R-O. And then uprights, which are, as the word explains, they're cuts that are upright on the glass. So they were the 3 fundamental cuts. And the Lismore pattern, 318, is the cut that is designed as 600 318, but the official name on it is Lismore pattern. Designed by Merrick Havel, one of the original designers in Waterford Crystal, and it's still the biggest selling pattern, I understand, is Waterford Crystal, and has been throughout the history of the place. It was fantastic. But that was the main pattern that apprentices learned. That was what we trained on. So you were able to cut the star on the base of the glass, you were able to do the caro pattern on the side of the glass, and then you were able to top that off with the uprights that sat into the caro. And so once you mastered those 3 key skills, really, you were set then to go out to the benches for a longer period. So after about 6 months or so, maybe 7, you were then assigned a bench. Usually, as the factory was expanding, new benches were being set up. So experienced cutters, people who would have been 10, 15 years at it or more at the time, would be made a master cutter. They used to be known as the first helper. You had a master cutter. A bench consisted typically of 6 people. The master, the first helper, which would be the next in line, and then 4 others of different, not necessarily skill levels, even though it was different skill levels, but different years in the factory. And so what generally happened when there was a new bench being set up, the first helper was promoted to be the new master cutter. And then that bench would be set up of a few experienced people and 1 or 2 of us out of the apprentice school. And we'd all then contribute. And it was the output of the bench, the output of the 6 of us on the bench, set the pay for the entire week. So we then had a different proportion or, percentage of that. So let's say of all the money made by the bench, the master cutter might have had, just say 50%, let's say that. I'm not certain of that, but it could have been 40%, whatever. The first helper then got another chunk of it. And then each qualified person had the same, and the apprentices then had a much smaller one. We may have had 5% each or something. So that's how we made our money. And and so it went like that then.
You didn't mind the actual pressure of that piece rate? You didn't?
No. I actually think that piece rate, it does keep you, there is pressure for sure. But it made sure that you got paid for the work you did. And if you didn't do the work, you didn't get paid. And so there was a reason behind it all. It kept productivity levels high, but it gave people and benches at the time an ability to earn their wages. Now there was a set floor that you wouldn't go beyond. So it wasn't that you were going to have 0. The unions made sure that it was always like a base, but there was always potential then to earn a lot more than that, and nearly everybody did. And eventually, as the factory went on, we cut the benches from 6 down to 3, and finally it even went down to individual piece rate. So it was absolutely then down to the individual, that what you could cut and produce yourself, each piece had a price on it. So for every piece that you produced that was saleable, that wasn't damaged or thrown in the bin, you got no compensation for losses or anything. You'd nearly have a piece finished and the next thing it would crack or smash or something. That was all that work on. So you had to really keep working. Some people took longer breaks, some people didn't. Some people spent more times in the toilets reading the newspaper, some didn't. And the earnings reflected that. So it was a very egalitarian system in that you had the possibility to earn depending on your skill levels and your ability to cut fast. Some were faster than others. I was never the fastest and I was never the slowest. I always had a kind of a middle range earning, even in my days on benches and my days as an individual cutter. But I was happy with that.
And you mentioned Pavel, and there was early people who originally trained people in the glass, people who came from Germany and Czechoslovakia and stuff like that. Did you meet any of those when you were out there?
I met Havel, of course, and I mean he was an absolutely gifted man. I think it's his son or grandson might even still be in the company now, but he could blow, he could cut, he could draw, paint, design. Anything that needed to be done with crystal, this man could do it. Absolute genius. And so I saw him working, witnessed him working and so on. We had Joe Kretzen, of course. Joe was I think it's Germany he came from, perhaps Czechoslovakia. But again, he was a renowned blower. Again, could blow anything and became supervisor and manager in the blowing room for years afterwards and so on. His son David Kretzen came into the factory and he too, an excellent blower. So there was a real relationship back to the days of the original guys that came from Germany, the Czech Republic and so on, to reintroduce the skill in the Johnstown factory. And then of course that was all transferred into the Kilbarry factory when they moved out of Johnstown.
And like some of the master blowers or master cutters that were around at your time, who what names would stand in mind?
The master cutter that I remember most, because he looked after me as an apprentice as I came into the cutting shops, was Paddy Grant. Lovely man, an absolutely gentleman, big into hunting and fishing. He's died since, but an absolutely lovely man. There's also another good friend of mine, Jack Jakes. Jack is still around, thank God. He was an excellent cutter as well. I mentioned Shammy Power. Shammy was a master cutter, and Tommy Hogan. Both of those were, very, very strong, powerful union representatives at the time. Very left-wing and very forward-thinking in terms of putting workers' causes. Both of those were excellent master cutters too. And there were many others. There were Muller Regan, another well-known lad around. Yeah, the lads that still might have a point up in the Mount Sion Centre will still, Morris being his name, but Muller we would call him. Muller still goes up there. So you had Morris Scanlon from Hennessy's Road, a big man, powerful man, but again an excellent cutter. He generally got all of the big pieces because he was so big and strong, putting in large bowls, centre pieces, all the heavy work. Morris could tear into these things, no problem. So they're the kind of names. Senan Cook himself now, Dr. Senan Cook, he's now heavily involved with the Dunhill Multi-Education Centre and with the I think it's City of Dublin University. Senan was again a very quiet individual from, I think it's Kilmacow originally, living in Dunhill now, but again an excellent cutter, but a gentleman, and a man again that was involved in the union in his day, but more a conciliatory view, I suppose is how I put it with Senan, but had a great way about bringing on people and dealing with people. So there was a whole range of people, but all of them were characters and all of them had their own different traits,
Talking about the union, did you get involved in the union?
From the very start, I've always been interested in workers' rights and trade unionism, and that came from my father. From his days when he used to tell me about his time in the Ford plant in Dagenham and how the conditions were bad, and that not only for him but for so many Irish of that time that went to England on the emigrant boat, the conditions were desperate on the building sites, the living accommodations and so on was very substandard. And so he used to talk to me for hours at night time. Now, it's often I wouldn't go to bed, it might be 1 and 2 in the morning, sitting down, listening to stories from my father about what they went through and what it was like. So I got a huge sense of, I suppose, social justice or social injustice from him. And so I always had something in me around trying to represent people or represent ourselves basically to the best we could. And so I took that with me into the Glass, and I joined the apprentice committee. The committees were made up of the blowing committee. You had the blowers, the cutters, the semi-skilled, the female section, and then you had to give the apprentices a kind of an apprentice perspective, I suppose, into the general union. But the senior union guys would always look after you anyway. I got involved at the apprentice level, and I've been involved with the union ever since. I'm still a member of Unite. I'm a representative, and I'm the current vice president of Waterford Council of Trade Unions. After all of those years, and even since the factory closed, I'm still involved and delighted to be involved with the trade union movement. And I spent all of the subsequent years, if not officially on committees of one way or another, I attended practically all of our union meetings, from the section meetings, as in the wedge cutting section, through to the general meetings where we had, what we would call the whole branch meetings. So the whole branch would be the I think it was the 386 branch and the 1164 branch. They were the various branches. So you would attend branch meetings as well and take part fully in all union activities.
And do you remember your first trade union meeting out in the Glass?
I don't, to be honest. I can't remember. There've been hundreds of meetings over the years, so I don't remember the first one. But what did strike me though about the meetings in general were the people at the top table and who they were, and who seemed to me very powerful people at the time. I remember Butch Power from up along Cannon Street. Butch was the chairman of the overall committee at the time. You had Walty Croke, you had Tommy Hogan and Shammy Shammy Power, who were young enough men at the time. They were the key figures that I remember from the union, and they were seen. Walter Cullen was another one, but young enough man at the time. But they struck me as these very powerful leaders from a worker's point of view, and they were the people who were going in to do battle on our behalf, as I saw it, with the management of the company. Now, having said that, there were some battles, but they weren't all battles either. A lot of the time, vast majority of the time, the relationships between the workers and the management in the company were excellent. And coming up with wage deals was never too. I remember times when there might be an offer of a pay rise from the company of 15% or something, and we'd be looking for like 25%. And this, it's given the modern trend now of 1 and 1.5% pay rises over X amount of years. The idea of 15 and 20% was bananas, but that's what it was. Now inflation was probably running at those kind of rates as well, but so they weren't ever. They used to have to negotiate a bit here and there, but bar the strikes and things we had, which came again not too frequently. It was generally very harmonious relationships, and the standards of pay, you see, were very good anyway. So people were happy with the work they had, and they were happy with the pay they were getting.
And the union also was very supportive of other things in the wider world, whether it be things that were happening in Northern Ireland or things that were happening, we say, Margaret Thatcher and the miners or whatever.
That's right.
So it was quite an interesting education for someone that was interested in politics or socialism and all that kind of stuff. It was like a university for politics. I mean, it was for those. You have to realise the vast majority of people there wouldn't have got any high academic achievements because we went in young as apprentices and so on, and so we learned an awful lot about the world and politics from the factory, and from the lads that we worked with, and the union leaders who were predominantly left wing, as you can imagine. And so we did take part in all kinds of campaigns, like you said, the thing about Thatcherism, the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland in 1981 and so on. The workers and key workers took key parts in that. The miners' strike, we fundraised and sent money across to the miners with a huge battle against Thatcher. And that was recognised in due course by the miners, who came to Waterford and presented us with various badges and things from the various mines, and a miner's lamp, which I'm not sure who have it these days, but an actual lamp from the mines was presented to it as well, in recognition of the support of Waterford Crystal workers to the miners. And indeed, during our sometimes strikes and during the shutdown period in '79, when the receivers came in and shut the place down, that help was reciprocated then by the miners, who remembered our help and sent money to support us and so on during the long sitting. So we built up great industrial friendships and links with the workers of across Wales and up around the areas of Liverpool, and those links still continue to this day, and I'm very proud of that period, because my view on the workers in England at the time in the mines, that Thatcher and Thatcherism was in its heyday, and it was the state against the workers. It was a classic state against workers battle, and she was determined to break the working class, and she saw the miners as the strongest group. So if I can break them, I can break anyone. And so it became a battle for survival. And in real life terms, in the mines and in the valleys, it did become a life and death struggle, because people did lose their lives. Either, I don't know if it was directly in confrontation with the police, but certainly through losing their jobs, losing their will to live and so on. There may well be people who died earlier than they should have. There were families destroyed. There were entire mining communities and villages destroyed, left empty, bereft after what Thatcher did to them. And that was right-wing economics, followed from Reagan and the Reaganism that went on at the time as well. This extreme right-wing economics that the state really hadn't a role to play in people's lives, that it was a conservative view that the market controlled everything. The market will solve everything. And we can see it now in Ireland today with the disgraceful housing crisis that we're now living through, and the state of the health services and so on. The market
rationale is still being put out there by our politicians, the Fine Gaelers in particular, that the market will fix everything. The market will fix the housing. The market is failing the housing. You know, the market follows profits. That's all the market is interested in. But there's a social aspect to housing. Back in the 40s and 50s, when Ireland had hardly any money, we built houses by the thousand for our people. And it showed then that we could do it. We could do exactly the same now, but that right-wing ideology is now in place, and that's something that I think we have to fight back against. And back in the days of the glass when we were involved, that was that kind of thinking that we kept fighting, that you always have to stand up for the working people, the ordinary man and woman in the street. And whatever that cause is, the cause of people we saw was the cause of labour, and the cause of labour was the cause of people. They were one and the same. And so that drove us on. The water rates was another great battle, if I can put it in those kind of terms. But the organisation that went into the water rates marches and everything, again, was driven, not exclusively, but to a huge degree by the workers of Waterford Crystal. And again, our left-wing politics and our ideology around not paying double tax and double taxation and so on. We had already paid for our water through our general taxation, and very heavily taxed in this country, as it turned out. And they were asking us to pay again. And so when the water, not even this, now the original campaign against water, not even the current one where there's a few protests and things, the original one involved, sending out crews that when people were cut off and disconnected, we had crews who went out and reconnected people. As soon as they were cut off and the boys were gone with the Garda escort, we had people in reconnecting the waters back into the houses. We had, directly outside my house in Hillview, a van, and I mean it's recorded in the newspapers, was held effectively captive, right? Nobody was kidnapped, but the lads were sitting in the van, and the van was surrounded by people, and the wheels of the van were all punctured. A certain additive put into the petrol, so it couldn't drive anywhere. And that was held for maybe 6-7 hours, immediately outside my front door. And that van had come up into our street, which is a cul-de-sac, and had cut off one or two houses from water. And of course, the call came into the factory. We had like flying columns. We all abandoned our work. I mean, would never happen, I'd imagine, these days. We all left our places of work on our benches, in the blowing rooms, up in the blowing shops. The irons were put away, and gangs of people drove to wherever the case happened to be. In this case, it was up in Hillview, in my street, Hawthorne Grove. And the van had been stopped by my wife and her mother, Mrs. Bridget McCarthy, who was, I believe, 76 years of age, if not 78 at the time. And she sat down on the road, the old woman now, Mrs. McCarthy, in front of the van, so they couldn't move. Where she got this out of, I don't know, but she was that strong. And there were other neighbours around, and they just kind of gathered around as well then. And with that, we started arriving. And once numbers built up, then it became 50, 100, 200, 300. And effectively, the van was surrounded. And this, again, was a sign of the times, of the battle around the water rates and the water meters, all them many years ago. And that's just one example. The same happened up in Lismore Park, a similar encounter again. A van was trapped and loads of people arrived up. And the workers tend to be workers from typical of how governments operate and factories might operate. Workers brought in from other places, Wexford, Dublin, Dundalk, wherever they came from, because local people couldn't do the work. The very same thing happened in the latest phase of it, when they tried to install water meters. And there were workers from other counties and perhaps even other countries brought in to do the work that local people wouldn't do. And again, we stopped it this time around. And so that goes to the heart of the kind of thing that went on in Waterford Crystal. Those were the kind of debates we had at union meetings. It wasn't just headaballs all heading off. We had debates about this stuff. What were the tactics? What should we do? What shouldn't we do? If we were making donations to particular causes, they all had to be passed at local meetings, branch meetings and so on. And so it was very well organised, but we learned so much, you know what I mean? I've learned a lot from academic studies subsequently, say in WIT and UCC and so on. But I learned every bit as much and perhaps even more important stuff from living and working in Waterford Crystal, and the camaraderie that went with the people in there. It was truly a fantastic, fantastic place to work. And it's a shame. And it's a shame that it's gone. And it never needed to go. Because I was on the joint negotiating committee at the time. And I remember the factory was in trouble. And we had lots of different schemes in the factory where we had redundancies, and we took huge, people think workers never did anything. We took huge wage cuts in order to keep the factory going over numerous years and years. But when it finally came to the crunch, it was a Fianna Fáil government in power at the time. And we had run out of money effectively, or very shortly we run out of money. But the company management again had negotiated, I think it was with Bank of America, a bridging loan essentially. And it was going to come through in about a fortnight's time. Roughly, that was the kind of thinking at the time. And we needed just money to get over that hump. And we couldn't quite get it. We had a meeting then, and the minister, she was from Donegal, and I can't think of her name now. Her name eludes me. But anyway, she came down with some of her officials, and I was on the joint negotiating committee, so I was there at the meeting. And we asked, first of all, that the government gives us the money. We were saying that there was a hole in the finances of about 30 million or thereabouts. So they said they couldn't do that, which we kind of expected anyway. They were saying that, it's against European rules. And we said, well, fair enough, but could you loan us the money then? This funding stream from America will come in 2 or 3 weeks, and you'll get your money back immediately, and it would have kept the factory going. It probably would have involved another round of redundancies and downsizing and all of that, but we would still have kept a substantial factory. And she said she couldn't do that either. That again, that was kind of seen as against European rules. Now we anticipated this kind of an answer, so we said to her, we said, the French over the years have bailed out Renault. The Italians had done the very same with Fiat. And we said even during this current crisis, the English government had given certain guarantees to the China company Wedgwood, which we had bought. Wedgwood thought they owned us. We actually owned them in that sense. But Wedgwood had been given certain guarantees. They were, suppliers to the royal family and all of that type of stuff. And even the German companies that we owned at the time had also been guaranteed they'd be looked after by the German government because of the rules the Germans had. So we pointed, Coughlin was her name, Minister Coughlin. So we pointed all that out to her. So we said, how come all these other governments have done it and you're saying it's against European rules? Well, she said, those governments, this is true as I'm sitting here, those governments can do whatever they like, she said. We're the Irish government and we follow the rules. And very shortly after that, the meeting ended. And that was our last lifeline, really. They turned their back on us. And the factory duly closed. And everything that flowed from that day. But I remember that meeting very, very well. And I think it was Mary Coughlin could have been her name. That's what she said. We're the Irish government, she said. And we follow the rules. Pardon? The workers sat in. Yeah, we then were still trying to do what we could to keep the place going. We were in constant meetings, the trade unions were, with the management and so on. Things were looking bad. And we had another meeting out in the Crystal Centre, out in the Social Sports Centre. I was at the meeting. And we got a phone call. The meeting had broken up and some of us were heading back into the factory to go back to work and whatever else. Some of us were on short time and all kinds of stuff. And a phone call came through that something was happening in the factory, lads. You need to get in. And I was driving into Cork Road, so I was one of the first in there. And it turns out that the receivers had come in secretly and brought in security people out of Dublin. And what happened was we'd gotten a phone call from people in the gallery in our showrooms because they had been told to tell people to start vacating the showrooms, that the showrooms were closing down. Tours were still in progress. So immediately something was happening. So we got into the showrooms and there were 2 or 3 shop stewards and we started ringing everybody else and saying, you better get in here quick, lads. There's something going on. We're still not sure what it is, but we think they're closing the factory. And with that then another 3 or 4 managed. So we ended up with about 6 or 7 shop stewards in the showrooms. So we went to these so-called security people and asked them, what are you doing? And they wouldn't answer us. And I think Walter Croke, I think, was the most senior man arrived at the time. And Walter said, look, Walter was the convener at the time. He said, I'm representing the unions here, he said. I want to know what's going on. And as far as I can recall, one of the lads said to him that, look, he said, we're just told to evacuate the office area here, the showrooms, and that we'll be closing the doors. So with that, they did actually close the doors and left one open where they were trying to shuffle people out, basically. So we wouldn't leave, the shop stewards, we wouldn't leave. And then there were other shop stewards got in. So what happened was the door that leads out into the car park, it was the main entrance where tourists came into it. That was closed, and these lads were sort of manning the door. And with this, crowd started to assemble outside of the office block because we had been ringing around, and friends and families were starting to arrive. Everybody was geared up for something happening. And so what happened was we didn't know whether it ended up with a bit of a scuffle, all right, but up to that point we were saying our shop stewards are outside the door, and there were a number of them hadn't gotten in. They had either gone home for a cup of tea on the way or whatever. There were several of the shop stewards that had been at the meeting in the glass factory centre outside. So we said to him, look, we're having a meeting with management on this now, which we weren't really having. You have to open the door and let those in, and they did. But once they opened it a few inches at all, it was arranged that the lads would rush the door, which is exactly what happened. So they pushed through the door, pushed your men out of the way as well, who tried to put up a little bit of a resistance. There was a bit of a scuffle. There were a few bits of punches thrown here and there. But with that, they were cleared out of the way. The other main doors, we reopened the doors. And then the crowds then came through the doors, and at that point, we occupied the entire gallery area. We then had to discuss very quickly were we going to occupy the entire office block, because the so-called security people had retreated from the gallery area out through another set of doors into what we call the reception area for the office block. So people who wanted to go up to the offices to visit managers or accountants or whatever, they came in through those doors. So they ensconced themselves out there. So we decided that we wouldn't eject them out of the whole place, and we wouldn't try and hold the whole building as such. We concentrated on the gallery area, the showrooms area. And so we did hold that place day and night from that point on until some resolution or some point where we then vacated it under an agreement. We vacated it. And I think I should remember off the top of my head, but I think the sit-in lasted 9 weeks. I think it was 9 weeks. Perhaps it was 11. Correct me on that, or we can check the record. And so we occupied it day and night. And during that period, now remember, this was working place at the time. There was highly valuable pieces of glass on display, food, wine, all kinds of stuff with the Gatchell's restaurant, which was also there. Nothing was damaged, nothing was stolen, and nothing was ever removed by the workers during that time. We actually secured all of the stuff, and we had all the valuable crystal moved out because we didn't want to be besmirched by doing anything illegal or underhanded or anything that would let down the cause or the name of the Waterford Crystal workers. And so we ensured, and now we didn't have to do much insuring because no one was looking to do that, but you'd always get a few people might be a bit hot-headed and think, well, if they're doing away with my job, I deserve this bowl, or you know what I mean, it's a human reaction. But we held the line on that, and we're proud of that we never did anything to damage. There was no fittings, no lights, no anything damaged. Everything was maintained properly and in proper order and was handed back in good condition after weeks of sit-in by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people.
And just talk a little bit about the fight for the pensions.
That was a long drawn-out fight. As you will know, when the factory went, the receivers basically gobbled up all of the assets. So the pension fund wasn't funded at all. It was, basically raided. There may have been some money left in it, but certainly not enough. And so we had to fight. We had no redundancy payments either. So we had to fight for all of this. This was now all part of the battle, and hence the sit-in and so on and so on. And so the Joint Negotiating Committee stepped into the breach again, as you'd expect. I was part of that. Tommy Hogan, Walter Croke was leading the charge at the time. Jimmy Kelly, the head of the union. Both of those deserve special mention. They were the lead negotiators for us, and are legendary, in my view, in trade union circles, and will be remembered for years. Whenever the story of the glass is told, with Jimmy Kelly and Walter Cullen will be mentioned because of their key role in this. But there were others, you know, Carol de Courcy, myself, Michael Goulding, Noel Atkins. There was a whole range of them, Donny Fell, Tommy Hogan. We were all the stewards at the time. I was representing the staff and management sort of branch, if you want to call it that. And that's how I was there. Peter Roach, colleague of mine, he was also part of it. And so Derek Chestnut, who was the accountant in the glass, he helped us. He was part of our staff team as well. So we were all involved in different levels of negotiations, but the key stuff was led obviously by Jimmy and Walter. But there were lots of to's and fro's and trying to get something out of the government, trying to get something out of the receiver. And eventually we came to a position where we got some kind of a redundancy payment. Again, nothing like what should have been, or if the factory was properly funded. But then the pensions came very much into focus because we had no pension. And so we had to start taking the receivers and indeed the Irish government to court, which we did. And only because we were members of Unite, we had switched from the Amalgamated Transport and General Workers Union, which had joined into a new union called Unite, that we actually had the funding to do that. And to fund that campaign, we had to hire like legal experts of all kinds of stuff, tax experts, headed up by Wallace and Byrne was the legal firm in Dublin. We had to have on deposit or on call €1 million effectively from the Unite funds to show that we could sustain this campaign all the way to Europe if necessary. And it turned out it was necessary. And indeed, SIP2 came on board with a promise of around 2 million, I think, or 200,000, yeah. Maybe 100,000 to 200,000. Because again, they saw, not because they had a lot of SIP2 members in our factory because it was a Unite factory, but the general implications of the pension and pension law throughout the country affected huge amounts of SIP2 members and indeed all trade unionists and all people. So this was now a fight for everybody's pension per se, but specifically centred around the crystal. And so we had to fight through all of the courts and win at every stage, all the way up to the High Court in Ireland, which we did. Justice Peter Kelly was the judge. He then said that as it was being taken under European law, he referred it to the European courts, and we had to again fight it all the way through the European courts and submit all of the grounds. And there were huge amounts of grounds and points of law that we submitted. And we were victorious on all points. We won on every single point of law in the European Court. So they then referred it back to the High Court for them to decide on the appropriate level of compensation. And that it would have to be the Irish government then would have to take that on. Because what I would call a double bankruptcy. It's where the pension fund itself is bankrupt, there hasn't sufficient funds to fund people, and the company that it belonged to is also defunct, i.e. Waterford Crystal. So there was a double bubble, and they were the kind of grounds of this thing. So in that scenario, it was ruled that the government, if it ever happens to any other worker, you know, they're secure if that happens to them, that their company goes and their fund is not efficient, the government have to step in. So it was a huge victory, not for just us, but for everybody in the country. And with the pensions negotiations, then we got down to the nitty-gritty of how much of a lump sum, how much of a pension and so on when you reach 63 if you were a craftsperson, or 65 for non-craft and so on. And we got various lump sums of different amounts. It was worked out then based on, there was all kinds of formula now. You want to be a mathematician to work this out. We probably had mathematicians working it out, and accountants. And everybody got something pro rata to their service, then pro rata to their rate of pay. And all of this then was projected over so many years to equal an amount. So you got a lump sum. There was also then the pension element. And so the residual pension would be different for different people, again, depending on their service, their rate of pay and so on, and their age profile. And there's now people with pensions from Waterford Crystal that would never have had it but for the campaign and the years and years of campaigning and negotiation that we were involved in. And there's people coming up now to the 63 mark and the 65 mark who have pensions waiting. Some might be small, they might be starting at maybe €100 or something, but they could be running up to €300 and €400 a week, which when you hit 65 or that age is significant because it adds to the old age pension. And so it means that you won't be rich, but you can live for as long as you can live for in reasonable comfort after giving your life to a company. I mean, some people, I did 36 years in the company. I know people did more than 40. One lad was in there 46 years to come out with essentially nothing. That's what we were facing, coming out with nothing. Basic statutory redundancy that the government would have to give you. That's what we were facing. But we fought and fought and fought. And again, it goes back to the spirit that's a common thread through the factory since I joined and since the years before I was even in there, of standing up for yourself, proper educated representation by people who knew their stuff, who knew how to negotiate on behalf of people and wouldn't take a step back. And we owe everything to that campaign. And as I said, led by Jimmy Kelly and Walter Cullen, I'm happy to say I was part of it. I was part of the Joint Negotiating Committee at the time, as were many others. But we put our best foot forward and we put down a marker to the government at the time. And I think we've saved the day for God knows how many other workers around this country because the law had to be subsequently changed because of our court actions here in Ireland and in the European Court. Fantastic victory for workers all over this country.
And Joe, I wanted to ask you too about, like, obviously for your family and all belong to you, it must be very proud for them to see a Hennessy's Road man become a mayor of Waterford, all that kind of stuff. Where did all that start? I mean, I know you started into the trade union movement in the glass factory, but outside of the glass factory, getting involved in politics, when did it all start?
It started, active involvement in politics started off with me just before the 1981 hunger strikes. That's what really got me interested in. I was always a Republican. My father's a Republican before me. And I hold socialist Republican views. And I will to the day I die. So I'm proud of that. I make no apologies for that. So I was always conscious again of working issues and so on, and working people's issues and ordinary people and the struggles. So I always kept an eye on the north of Ireland and what was going on up in the north, in what was commonly known then and still considered the occupied 6 counties. And so when the hunger strikes was building up to the hunger strikes, and the one of you know, the 1981 kind of strike where there's so many hunger strikers lost their lives and so on. I was heavily involved, as were a lot of people in the glass, in that campaign. And I had joined Sinn Féin at the time. And so I was a Sinn Féin member and through the glass factory involved in the hunger strike campaign at a local level. And so that's where the I suppose active politics began, campaigning and going door to doors. And I got involved in the early local elections in the city here when Sinn Féin were only starting to get in there. When, you know, if there was a kind of a, I suppose, a survey done or a poll done, you know, Sinn Féin would register at something like 0.5% or under 0.5%. It was lucky that there was, you know, was recorded at all, really. So there was really no support for the party. And there was a handful of us involved. And so I would go door to door, you know, canvassing for who the candidates would be at the time. Noel Ryan tended to be our candidate at the time. And, you know, so different from today. The printing of the leaflets went on in my house, in my front sitting room, during the night, 2, 3, 4 a.m. We used to have what's called a hand-driven Gestentner printer. Gestentner was the name on it, a German device. And you pour in ink into a kind of a well, and you could print little A4 flyers at best. They may even have been A5. So we'd have one of them typed up by somebody. Usually someone in the press would help us out. And we would then just copy that, run it through. And all through the night we'd get out maybe 200 or 300 leaflets. And that'd be the leaflets for the next day's campaign. And that night we'd be off doing the same again. And myself and my wife Frances, like I said, Noel Ryan, the likes of Davy English, Donald Barry, people like that were Johnny Houlihan. We were the people at the time that used to do the local canvass. Now, we'd get very small, the lads would end up with 100 votes or something, or 200 votes, this kind of thing. But we stuck with it through very, very hard times. This was in the teeth of, huge violence and counter-violence, both loyalist, Republican and British going on in the north. The campaign in England was ongoing and so on. So through all of that, I became more and more interested in politics. And I was duly elected then as a Sinn Féin councillor, myself along with David Cullinan, the first two Sinn Féin councillors elected since Cathal Brugha, I understand it, back in 1921. So that's another huge, important point for me, huge historical thing.
And was there a lot of, did people look down their noses at Sinn Féin people?
Well, I think a lot of people did. We were considered often murderers, terrorists, and all of the stuff that goes into popular culture of how you describe people. But we considered ourselves political activists, fighting on a political front for human rights, for civil rights in the north, supporting our fellow countrymen and women in the north who we saw were being abandoned by the rest of the country and by the political parties of the time, who turned their back and were afraid to stand up to the British. And that's how we saw it. It was more complex than that, but in a simple analysis, that's about the size of it. So we stood our ground as we saw it, and did what we felt was right to do at the time, which were horrendous times. It's very easy for people these days to forget what it was like back then.
And locally, was this before the whole Workers' Party thing, or was this?
The Workers' Party existed at the time as well. As did the Irish Republican Socialist Party, known as the IRPs, the IRSPs. So there was a lot of different groups.
It was very divisive.
Yeah, it was divisive. And people, they say the first thing that ever happens in the left is the split. And so that shows it like that. There were different people with different analysis and different ideas of how to bring things forward. But I was on the Republican side and with Sinn Féin. So that was the side that I fell in with. But I was always a left-wing and a socialist person. But I don't see myself as anything bananas or anything. I always felt that I could see what I would see reason or the middle ground, if you understand it.
And speaking of the middle ground, you were on the management in the class, weren't you, in the sense of...
In a sense that I was involved in industrial engineering. I qualified in WIT as a diploma in industrial engineering when I was still a cutter. I did all this through night school.
And did the class pay for your training?
They did for that particular one. And they were excellent at that. They had huge educational programs in the glass factory where almost all money for almost any course was paid at the time by the factory. Now in turns they cut it back a bit to 80% and 50%, but at that time they fully paid for my industrial engineering. That gave me then the opportunity to apply for a job. Now they were downsizing the cutting shops at the time anyway. So I got the opportunity and I moved then into industrial engineering under the managership of Jim O'Neill, a man from Cathal Brugha Street, another chap who actually came from the floor. He was working at the layer, at the back of the layer in the blowing room at the time, taking the glass that had cooled off the layer and putting it into the trays. He himself had worked his way up and became a senior manager within the factory. It's particularly true industrial engineering. So I worked there for a number of years. Then I became the plant industrial engineer for Plant 2, which was known back in the old days as K4. So K4 and K3 combined became what's generally known then as Plant 2. So we had Plant 1 and Plant 2. Then we had Butlerstown and Dungarvan. So they were considered the 4 plants, even though 2 of them were on the Kilbarry site. And so from that point of view, I was certainly on staff, but not a manager as such, if you know what I mean. But some people then didn't like that role because I was putting times on the glass and rates of pay on the glass that people then had to cut. But that was done in a very measured and a kind of a scientific way of doing it, as fairly as it could be. I never would have put a rate of glass onto a glass that was, impossible to achieve, or that was like trying to get blood out of a stone. That never happened. Some people would have that idea, but the reality is it never happened. Kevin Noctor was also an industrial engineer on contract basis to the union. And so he could, and often did, examine any work that I did to see had I done something wrong in the figures or done something strange. And he himself would go back down on the floor and with a stopwatch do timing on the same individual, on the same kind of glass. And invariably, bar a couple of seconds here or there, he came up with the same answers. So if there was any slight difference, then we'd agree a kind of a middle ground, myself and Kevin, and then he'd go back to the cutting shop committee and say, look, I see nothing wrong with this. And then they became the piece rates. But an awful lot of people either didn't understand that's how it worked. Some people didn't even want to know that's how it worked.
Look, it's interesting that you're willing, you seem to be always willing to take an unpopular position, with your fellow workers or with the wider public in relation to your beliefs and stuff like that.
Well, you see, I always felt that I was right in what I was doing. From the work perspective, I knew I wasn't conning anybody or fooling anybody. It was absolutely down the middle. There's a book called the ILO Handbook, and all our standards are set and measured in line with that. That's the international recognised standard by the International Labour Organisation, an organisation that all the unions subscribe to as well. So we were all operating off the same template. So I knew there was nothing wrong there. Secondly, in terms of the popular position or the position within politics in general, I read things as I saw them. Where I felt there was an injustice, then I think I'm always prepared to stand up for that. And even now, as a councillor, I still take the position where I stand up and trying to defend anything that I see wrong or help anybody that I can. And also as Mayor of the Metropolitan area, I've taken positions as the Metropolitan Mayor, and I've pushed out the role of the Metropolitan Mayor in my year as much as I possibly can, because it is undermined, there's no question, by the amalgamation of the city and county by Phil Hogan at the time, which I believe was a move to undermine the strength of Waterford City as the regional centre of the southeast, in favour of trying to strengthen Kilkenny and Wexford under Brendan Howlin. And since the amalgamation, several of the key services have been stripped out of the city and relocated to Kilkenny and Wexford. So I think the evidence is there. But nonetheless, the primary role now is the plenary mayor, as the current position is known. But I've always pushed out the boat as far as I possibly can within the rules of the Metropolitan Mayor, because this is where the history is. This is where the 600 and 700 year history of mayors reside, in the city. The Metropolitan Mayor is, in my view, the rightful successor of that history. The plenary mayor was set up just under 5 years ago. There is no history of mayors in the county, never were. Chairman or Cathaoirleach is the position, has always been, and it's still the case. Even in Kilkenny, they have the Mayor of Kilkenny, and they have the Cathaoirleach of Kilkenny County Council, and there's no confusion. So anyway, that's beside the point. I'm still taking positions, though, that mightn't be as popular or that others might shy away from, because I think they're right, and I think they're defendable positions, and they're born from proper analysis and investigation, and coming to then a logical conclusion based on that analysis. So it's not off-the-cuff stuff.
Joe, thanks very much. Before we finish, just a couple of things I want to get you to talk about is pieces of crystal that we have here, and maybe just I'll leave them here, and then you can pick them up and talk.
I will.
And then also just maybe before we finish, I'll take out the chain as well.
Yeah. Just as you were saying, Ollie, about coming from Hennessy's Road and becoming the Metropolitan Mayor, my family are extremely proud. I know you mentioned that, but they are. I'm extremely proud. It's the proudest thing in my life that I've become, other than a father to my children, but in public life, to be the mayor and to be here to represent the city as I see it as best I can. I'm truly honoured and proud to do so. And I was asked only last week in an interview on radio about money associated with this and this move towards directly elected mayors, which I don't think is a good idea. But I said that the actual allowance for the mayor at this role is €18,000. But which I take, it's given to you, that's the way it is. But I said that if there was no allowance, I would still be the mayor and still as proud and still do as much as I'm doing now, because it's not for the money. It's the honour and the privilege of being seen as the first citizen. That's what matters to me. And my mother and father passed away since, but they would be so proud of that. That another one, as you said, from Hennessy's Road, sitting in the mayor's parlour as mayor is a hugely significant thing. But going back to the glass and the days, the piece I'm just having in my hand here now, as you can see, there is actually, from the days of apprenticeships, you had to qualify, you had to be tested. And so there's a 3-year test, a 4-year test, and a 5-year test. And this piece here, which I'm holding now up, is the 3-year bowl. And it's the bowl that you must cut at the end of your 3 years training. And you can see it's a lovely design, it's fairly intricate, it's a fruit bowl. But it's basic enough compared to what we're going to see in a minute. But this is my actual 3rd year bowl that I cut from scratch myself. And it obviously passed, and I got my A grade and I moved on. So that's my third year bowl. So then I was safe to progress into the 4th year. And again, you move on into the 4th year. And at the end of the 4th year, you do another bowl. This is the 4th year bowl, and you can see this one now, if the camera can pick it up, it's far more intricate. The type of design, the level of cutting, the caro which I spoke about, the swerves are now starting to come into it. Long uprights, like long fingers at the top of the bowl, far more intricate. The detail is very fine. The point in the centre, this is still a star that you can see here, coming through to the point here in the centre, very, very defined point. All of these are separate individual cuts, but they cut through the exact centre at exactly the same point, as if they were drawn with a pencil. But remember, we done these with stone wheels. That's how we cut these ones. These weren't done on even the modern diamond wheels. These were done on the old stone wheels. And that's the kind of accuracy you had to come up with. So I duly passed that one. And then we move on then to the final piece, which is this one. It's called the 5-year bowl, or the apprentice bowl. And this is the one where you actually become a qualified cutter. And you had to cut one of these. Every one of us had to cut one of these. Again, you can see the level of intricacy has gone up no end. You have Russian caro, which is this little thing here. You have the swerves, the uprights. You have multi-edge cutting here. But this multi-edge is actually done as that we have wheels now that have multi-edges on them. But in my days, this was done in a single wheel. Every single little piece that you see here is one cut after the other, and they all had to cross at the same angle. They all had to intersect at the same angle, all the way down. And then at the bottom, you have a very intricate star, as you can see. It's like the Star of David, but it's even far more intricate than that, with again an even more intricate one in the centre of the intricate star. So the level of skill to cut these is quite high, as you can see. So people now become apprentices, and they do electricians, and they do fitters, electricians, and they all do their own work, and qualify in their own way. But we qualify by actual production of pieces of crystal. And there's a little bit of glue still on the back there from years ago, but my name is actually engraved on it there, which is they do when you pass your bowl, and it's J. Kelly, 1979. So that's the year that I qualified in Waterford Crystal as a cutter. So these are the key pieces.
And with just the chain, talk us through the...
Absolutely. This is the chain that I now wear as the Metropolitan Mayor. You can see on it, it's a very heavy chain. The actual makeup of it, I believe, is silver predominantly, and there's some other precious metal which I just can't think of the name of. And And on the blue medallion part of it, again, which is very heavy, you can see the ships that are on it, the 3 ships. And that's harking back to the Waterford as the, the port, the historical maritime history of Waterford. And we were known as Waterford of the ships for centuries. And this reflects that kind of tradition. And then we have individual links that go along it. And they're interspersed by an image of Reginald's Tower. Again, the iconic structure that's on the corner of the quay and the Mall. And then the new bridge. There's a link added in with basically the outline of the new bridge that crosses the River Suir. And it's very similar, I suppose. It's actually very similar to the outline of the bridge if you look at it from a distance. So that's there. So those links are interspersed all along the whole way. And each one of them, all of them, they're all hallmarked at the back. So every single piece of the chain is all hallmarked. So it's quite an expensive chain. The main chain is now retired. The old one, which is solid 18 karat gold, it's on display in the Mears display out here in the Mears Museum, and it's so valuable, first of all, and it's also, the gold is 18 karat, and it's starting, because of years, hundreds of years, it's starting to wear. So in order to protect the chain and maintain it, that's now put away, and it's brought out on very rare occasions, perhaps St. Patrick's Day or the visit of the President or something like that. But predominantly this is the chain that's worn these days now, and you can see it's a very substantial chain, very well put together, and it represents the role and the position of Mayor of Waterford City and the metropolitan area. And again, as I said, I'm very proud to wear that. So when you look at it, a Hennessy's Road man, born and bred, born in 128 Hennessy's Road, a glass factory man all my life essentially, trade unionist and socialist and Republican all of my life, into politics, and now a councillor and the mayor of the metropolitan area of Waterford. It's a real journey. It's been up and down, mostly up I have to say, but I'm delighted to have done it. And from the educational days back in Mount Sion, when the teachers regularly beat us and told us you never amount to anything, or the best you'll do is sweep the streets, which is nothing wrong with being a street sweeper. I've subsequently went on, as I mentioned, in night school and got my diploma in industrial engineering from WIT. I have a Bachelor of Business from WIT. I have an MBA from WIT and studied also in America for that. I have a diploma in social science from UCC and University College Galway, as well as that. And subsequently set up my own business, Insight Recruitment and Training, and have employed a lot of people over the years. So for someone that was told in Mount Sion that you'll never amount to anything and you'll be lucky if you can sweep the streets, to have achieved those academic achievements, plus the political achievements, plus the achievements in commerce and setting up my own business and employing people, then I think I have put the lie to what the teachers and the brothers in Mount Sion said when they said, it wasn't just me, there were others. You lot will never amount to anything and you'll be lucky if you get to sweep the streets. So I think it's been a big journey from the days of Mount Sion to sitting here in the Mayor's Parlour. And thank you very much for the opportunity to do this.
Well done. Thanks very much.
Is that good enough?